everybody.
Thank you, Tammy Sue. We're glad to have everyone here today.
Yes.
And we have with us Lieutenant Colonel Robert Maginnis back, and he is ready to go.
Yes.
I mean, he's got stuff that's going to shock you.
That's right.
It's going to wake you up, I hope.
Yes.
This is the kind of people that we need to listen to.
Yes.
Lieutenant Colonel Robert Maginnis is a retired U.S. Army infantry officer and an experienced and internationally known expert on national security and foreign affairs. He currently serves as a senior strategist at the Pentagon with duties that involve multinational programs. Colonel Maginnis spent a year on the Korean DMZ and traveled. We had asked him about that, by the way,
so
because that's kind of fascinating to me.
Mm-hmm.
And he traveled throughout North and South Asia, including Japan, Hong Kong, the Philippines, Thailand, Australia. His assignments included Germany, Alaska, and various places inside the USA.
Wow.
He has over 30 years of national media experience as an on-air national security and foreign affairs analyst on all major television and most radio networks. Is the author of 8 books, including Alliance of Evil. His latest book is Collision Course: The Fight to Reclaim Our Moral Compass Before It's Too Late. So, welcome back to the program, Colonel Robert Maginnis.
Thank you, Pastor.
How's things in Washington, D.C. these days?
Well, we have a tall fence around the People's House. We have a lot of COVID that has the federal government still rather locked down, but things are beginning to recover given the vaccines and, but at the same time, Mr. Biden is, waging what I argue is a revolution against the American people.
What do you believe his foreign policy direction will be?
Well, we saw in Alaska weeks ago when we met with the Chinese counterparts, and they basically handed us our lunch. The Chinese have assessed the United States under Mr. Biden as weaker than we were clearly under Mr. Trump, and that's dangerous. We also have seen in the last few weeks a testing by the Russians. Clearly, Vladimir Putin sending 100,000 troops to the border with Ukraine has communicated a test once again for Mr. Biden. And though Mr. Biden has proposed having a summit this summer, which is to be determined whether or not that happens, it is demonstrating that there's a perception of weakness by the Biden administration. We have seen, of course, some recent missile shots by the North Koreans, which indicate, typically that they're always trying to test a new administration. This particular administration has yet to say that it's truly going to do what Mr. Trump did, and that is to, get past the rhetoric and move forward on something substantive. And then, of course, Iran. Iran is beginning to shake its sabers at us. We have seen not only a tit for tat with regard to what perhaps the Israelis are doing against their nuclear sites, but also the missiles that have been launched recently at the Israeli nuclear facility. And then, of course, only a week or so ago, we saw an attack or close to an attack on U.S. vessels in the Strait of Hormuz. So given those issues, given a number of others that are percolating out there, Mr. Biden has a lot to learn. Hopefully, he won't lead the nation to war. I suppose the only thing that I've seen thus far that has truly indicated a way ahead is what he's decided with regard to Afghanistan. Somewhat against some of the military personnel in the Pentagon, he has decided to end our 20-year occupation or a 20-year war in Afghanistan and remove our troops. That appears to be underway and will likely finish prior to the 20th anniversary of 9/11.
Has President Biden spoke directly with Russian President Vladimir Putin yet?
Yes. President Biden has spoken with Vladimir Putin a couple of times, it appears. Most recently, when he spoke with him, he offered to host a summit, probably in Western Europe, to hopefully mitigate some of the tension that is rising. The tension, of course, is a byproduct of a test of Mr. Biden with the deployment of all those troops and, their armored vehicles to the border with Ukraine. Now, keep in mind, it was in 2014, following the Sochi Olympics, that Vladimir Putin invaded Crimea and took over Crimea and has, basically settled on it being a province of the Russian Federation. They have been battling off and on since that time in eastern Ukraine with a variety of militia and even conventional forces. The Ukrainians desire to maintain the sovereignty over the eastern part of that country. We're engaged with training for the Ukrainian forces. And of course, we've seen a number of flashpoints. We've seen downing of aircraft. And of course, NATO has promised to come to Ukraine's aid. And Putin feels as if this is a threat, an existential threat against his regime. So that plus the issues of nuclear upgrading of his arsenal. The Russians have been heavily investing in nuclear weapons. They're making hundreds of new nuclear weapons every year, whereas we haven't made any for quite a few years. And so all of that points toward a true existential threat, potentially posed by the Russians, as the leading military intelligence officials said only a week ago that, yes, because of their nuclear programs, they do pose a very serious threat against the United States, in spite of the fact that they have a troubled economy and other issues to deal with.
Russia has significantly increased its flights into the Alaska Air Defense Identification Zone, the most since the Soviet Union fell in 1991. What does this mean?
Well, the Russians are testing us not in Ukraine, Pastor, but also on the west coast of the United States, and more specifically off the coast of Alaska. Now, I've spent years in Alaska. I know the region quite well. The Russians have reoccupied many of those Arctic and subarctic military facilities that were long ago, at the end of the Cold War, abandoned. Now they're reoccupied, and they've radically increased their air flights to test our air defense capabilities. Now, of course, in Alaska at Fort Greely, we have a medium-range anti-ballistic missile system, which was mostly installed to counter the long-term missile threat posed by North Korea, but it also helps us to defend against a potential attack by the Chinese or even the Russians. But the incursions are truly trying to not only exhaust us, but to intimidate us. It's a similar tactic that we're now seeing played out, which we can talk about later on, by the communist Chinese against the independent country of Taiwan. So there are a host of geopolitical things happening here, and this is very, very disconcerting.
It seems like Russia is stepping up its threat towards the U.S. Let's watch this B-roll of video, and I'll ask you to comment on it.
Russian President Vladimir Putin telling the West to back off. This comes amid international concern over his troop buildup on the Ukraine border. Here in the U.S., one top military commander says the chances of nuclear war are actually increasing.
Russian President Vladimir Putin issued a stark warning to the U.S. and NATO during his annual State of the Nation address to Parliament.
I hope that no one dares to cross the red line in respect to Russia, and we will determine where it is in each specific case.
Putin spoke as Russia continues a massive military buildup on the border with Ukraine. New satellite images show dozens of fighter jets lined up on tarmacs in southern Russia and Crimea. Top U.S. military commanders warned that new threats facing the U.S. have them seriously worried for the first time that U.S. adversaries may consider using a nuclear weapon as the, quote, least bad option. The admiral in charge of America's nuclear arsenal says it's the first time in history the U.S. has had to deter two nuclear powers at the same time, Russia and China.
I cannot deter with the leftovers of the Cold War forever into the future. That is a 70-eras weapon system that I'm going to have to employ against 2030 level threats.
Some Democrats want to scrap one leg of the nuclear triad, the 400 ground-based missiles currently in silos across 3 states. The head of Strategic Command says he needs to replace, not update, those 50-year-old Minuteman III missiles. The U.S. stopped keeping nuclear-capable bombers like these B-52s in Louisiana on 24-hour alert in 1991. But Admiral Richard warns if the U.S. scraps its ground-based missiles, it would have to rely too much on submarine-launched nukes.
And under those conditions, I would request to re-alert the bombers.
Putin boasted today that Russia will have modernized more than 88% of its nuclear weapons by the end of this year. Admiral Richard says the U.S. hasn't started.
This is shocking. What do you think, Colonel?
You know, the Russians have changed their nuclear deployment doctrine, especially with what we call tactical smaller nuclear weapons, and have talked about in their own writings that first use, unprovoked first use against conventional forces might be allowed. And so that sends a very clear signal that they may be willing to use some of those nuclear weapons. Now, what was said there in the testimony is so very true. We've done a nuclear posture review of our own inventory, and as they indicated, our ballistic missiles are old, the warheads are old, the B-52s, and even the nuclear-launched submarine missiles are old. We have not invested. We need to invest in order to not only to keep par with the Russians, who have continued to radically upgrade their own. But the unknown factor here is the addition of the Chinese nuclear arsenal, which is a threat as well as the North Koreans, which there's a lot of mystery about that, and even the Iranians, who, according to Mossad and the Israelis, are probably working on capabilities as well. So what I heard is spot on. This is a true existential threat to our best interest. If we want to remain credible, we have to empower the Pentagon to upgrade those old weapons. The technology is just ancient. You know, the technology goes back 60, 70 years on some of these weapons. And, we're talking about 2021 today, not 1951.
This past week, Secretary of State Blinken warned Turkey and other U.S. allies against buying weapon systems from Russia. Why is that an important move by Biden administration? Will it work?
Well, keep in mind, Turkey is part of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It's one of the 30 nations that make up the Western Alliance. It's a treaty organization that's very important to the preservation of democracies in the West. Now, Turkey, a year ago, purchased from the Russians the S-400 air defense system, a very sophisticated, very capable air defense system. That becomes problematic for us as an alliance when they buy weapons platforms from a country that we consider an adversary. And of course, when you share the technologies of these various weapons and you try to make them what we call interoperable, in other words, blend those weapon systems into the broader air defense umbrella over Western Europe, then it becomes very, very dangerous for the other NATO allies. We tried to encourage them to buy, Patriot air defense systems made by the U.S., certainly radar systems made by the U.S., but Erdogan, the president of Turkey, refused. Rather, he met with Vladimir Putin. They have already received some of the batteries of the S-400s, which happen to be, interestingly, also sold to the Chinese. So they have a very capable system, but it's not compatible at all with that of NATO, and therefore it undermines the integrity of the alliance.
Wow.
I wanted to ask you before about the EMP bomb. Is that something that Russia may want to use that would supposedly not cause as much damage, but yet it does in the long run?
Yeah. Well, there's no doubt. The EMP is just the explosion of a nuclear weapon above the ground. Sometimes it can be 100 miles above the ground, or it can be much lower. It depends upon the effects that you want to have. We have in the military entire volumes of information that tells us the size of the weapon, what the effects that you want, and therefore where you have to ignite that weapon in order to have that type of effect. So if you don't want to have destruction of buildings and the like, but you do want to use the electromagnetic force of a nuclear weapon, then you probably are going to execute it well above ground at a particular altitude, so that you can basically make inoperable most of the electronics that are in that plume of ground that would be directly impacted by the EMP blast from that nuclear weapon.
In March of this year, Russia deployed perhaps 100,000 troops and their equipment to the eastern border with Ukraine. What was the Moscow's intent behind such a risky action?
Well, it was really a test. Early on, adversaries are going to test the mettle of a new administration, much like the Chinese have, and much like the Iranians and North Koreans are, as well as the likes of Al-Qaeda and the terrorists around the world. At this point, it would appear as if our response has been to call Mr. Putin and say, call off your troops, let's sit down and talk. Whether or not that works with Vladimir Putin and his hegemonic, his ambitious ambition to grow the influence over the former periphery of the old Soviet Union is to be determined. I think it's really about follow through, and if that follow through is not rigorous, and so far I haven't seen a rigorous follow through, then we are certainly in new times and dangerous times going ahead.
The U.S. is signaling Moscow that it's serious about defending Ukraine. Recently, the U.S. European Command sent its top special operation general to Kyiv to look for ways to expand training with Ukraine. What is the message being sent to Moscow?
Well, the commander of NATO, who happens to be dual-hatted as the U.S. European Command's commander, sent his subordinate, the Special Operations Command, a two-star general, to Kiev to sit down and see what they could do. Now, keep in mind, most of the fight in the eastern part of Ukraine has been really counterinsurgency, small teams. There have been obviously some larger engagements. There's been a lot of artillery fire, a lot of use of drones that call in that artillery. There have been, of course, a lot of skirmishes, and this has been going on now for about 7 years. And so we want to make sure that our counterparts in the Ukrainian army are properly prepared, and that includes special operations operatives that are trained at a facility that the United States helped to build in western Ukraine, so that soldiers are getting realistic training. And we have, of course, U.S. Soldiers and others that are in western Ukraine working hand in glove with their counterparts to help train them. But the message is clear that we are committed, according to what the EUCOM commander has done here, we are committed to helping our ally, the Ukrainian armed forces, the Ukrainian people, to ward off the threats posed by the Russians, first by taking Crimea, and then, of course, by infiltrating and working and arming the insurgents in eastern Ukraine.
You have two books today that we're offering.
That's right.
What's
right
the price
now,
on that?
for a $30 donation, you receive two of Colonel Maginnis's books, The Collision Course, The Fight to Reclaim Our Moral Compass Before It's Too Late. So that you'll receive one of those along with The Alliance of Evil, Russia, China, the United States, and a New Cold War. Has the mystery of the end times finally arrived? And I love what Lieutenant General Boykin, he's warning here. He's saying brilliant unveiling of how events of Ezekiel 38 and 39 are coming to fruition. These right here, both books, to receive both of them, they're amazing books by Colonel Maginnis for a donation of $30 to the ministry. And that does include the shipping and handling for both books.
Excellent.
Which is these books are talking about a Cold War with Russia and China.
Yeah, this is where we are right now. As I'm listening to Colonel Maginnis, while America's worried about a woke nation and social justice issues, look what the world around us is doing. They're working on getting their militaries upgraded. I mean, we have to wake up.
Why would we have this Cold War with China and Russia? What is their reason to want to bring down America?
Well, we're their primary adversary, Pastor, and both nations, President Xi Jinping in Beijing and Vladimir Putin in Moscow, are very ambitious, very hegemonic. You know, Putin wants to regain the status of the former Soviet Union as a polar power in the world. President Xi has made it very clear by the middle part of this century, he wants to have the world's largest economy and the world's strongest military. And in order to reach that lofty goal, he must diminish the United States. And so they are credibly moving rapidly forward. And by 2035, President Xi has made it very clear in his own public statements and his writings that they have every intention of being a world-class armed forces. And I think that the evidence that we see in the South China Sea and the East China Sea, and we're beginning to see Chinese operatives all over the world, we should take this very, very seriously.
Why are they trying to take advantage of us right now?
The whole idea of perception is very, very important in geopolitics. And unfortunately, our current leadership in Washington is so myopically focused on domestic issues, as you indicated, whether it's wokeness or it's some sort of domestic economic package, whereas our true existential enemies are looking at us and saying, this is an opportunity perhaps to not only knock the United States down a couple notches, but perhaps something much worse.
We're offering your two books today.
Yes.
And these books usually are at least $20 retail. And we're offering it today for $30 for both of them.
That's right.
Is that
Plus
right?
the shipping and handling. That's right. $30 donation for both books, the Collision Course, along with the Alliance of Evil book for a $30 donation. And that includes the shipping and handling.
Colonel, why should they read these books? What is going to help them to understand where we're headed in the last days and to fight to reclaim our moral compass before it's too late?
Well, the first one, Pastor, Alliance of Evil, written a couple of years ago, and I said there is a new Cold War. At the time, very few people believed it. Well, fast forward to today, I'm finding very few people that don't believe it. I lay out 16 indicators in there of the new Cold War. And of course, we're fighting this new Cold War on four battlefronts, where it's in cyber, and they're constantly robbing us blind of our intellectual property. We're battling them ideologically. Obviously, they're using their stakes, their mechanisms in the United States to go after us in terms of election interference, in terms of propaganda. They control much of what Hollywood says because of their leverage over the studios. We also see militarily and technologically. Militarily, their military is rapidly growing into a near peer of the United States. That's part of basically what Mr. Trump said in his first national security strategy. That's very important, but so is the technology. They have created an artificial intelligence effort to take over much of what's going on in the world through artificial intelligence operations. In fact, President Xi in 2017 made it clear that he has every intention of taking over the internet by gaining control over kind of the bones of the mechanisms that run the global internet. And what might that mean? That means basically he can control what you see and what you don't see. If you do a search on Google or whatever, they would control what would come up. And if they don't, in what they call the red zone, if they don't want you to see an article that's discriminatory or certainly saying things bad about China, then it will never appear. So that's part of the ideological war. And then, of course, we have seen other indications economically. The Chinese, in spite of the COVID-19 pandemic, increased their economic prowess, their GDP, this past year, whereas most of the world went down. And the Chinese are continuing to enjoy that. So across those four battlefronts, and I go into great detail in the book and demonstrate that this Chinese enemy, as well as the Russians in a couple areas, not as much as the Chinese, are clearly in a new Cold War. It's very different than the old Cold War, but it's true. On collision course basically talks about where we are today. We've lost our moral compass. We have an element that is tearing apart the very civil liberties and the very institutions that make and made this country great. They target the family, they target the faith community. They, of course, have taken over as best as they can the media, which they control. They've taken over the education establishment. And, of course, they've taken over much of government. And I show the rich heritage of our great nation as all the way back to when the original settlers came here, whether they were Puritans or whether they were Baptists here in Virginia or Presbyterians down in South Carolina. I look at that history, where we started, how all these institutions started, and they were faith-based, they were Christian-based, and how we have just evolved into something that our founders wouldn't recognize today. So, both books, I think, are contemporary in terms of the important things that are going on before us. If you want to understand the battle with Russia and China, read Alliance of Evil. If you want to understand the domestic challenges in our own history, read Collision Course.
Wow. Very good. Wow.
Russia and Turkey play significant geopolitical roles, and both have somewhat adversarial roles in relation to Israel. How then should we interpret the critical prophecy in Ezekiel 38 and 39 as it applies to Gog, Magog, and Israel?
That's a good question, Pastor, and it's a hard one to answer because, whether it's Erdogan, who is the Islamist dictator, arguably, in Turkey today, who has every intention, if given the opportunity, to take over much of the Middle East, and he's making strides, thank you. Or, is Gog, the likes of Vladimir Putin, the president for life, and given what they've done to their constitution, that happens to reside in a place that some people say Magog is really in Russia today, and others say, no, Magog is in Turkey today. Well, honest people trying to understand this are going to disagree perhaps as to locations and how we come to those conclusions. However, what I do believe to be true is that there is a rising leader. Don't know if it's a Erdogan or a Putin or someone after them or someone that exists even today. And I don't know if it's necessarily going to come out of Turkey or if it's going to come out of the the stands, or perhaps Armenia or Georgia or Ukraine, or even the motherland of Russia. It could be a host of places. Yes, we will disagree perhaps sometimes about the exact timing, the exact location, and the nature of the leaders, but it's clear it's going to happen, as we see in Ezekiel.
Recently, allegations that former Secretary of State John Kerry may have provided Iranian Foreign Minister Zarif inside information on Israeli military operations. These were made. And let's watch this news piece, and then I'll have you give us your thoughts.
A leaked discussion with Iran's chief diplomat reveals just how powerful Iran's military is and what John Kerry was saying about one of America's closest allies. Iranian Foreign Minister Javad Zarif claims, quote, "It was former U.S. Foreign Secretary John Kerry who told me Israel had launched more than 200 attacks on Iranian forces in Syria." The Israeli government had no comment on Zarif's claim. The State Department pointed to reports where the Israeli government publicly confirmed the strikes. It's unclear if Zarif mentions when Kerry may have told him this information. Congressman Michael McCaul, the top Republican on the House Foreign Affairs Committee, says, quote, "If true, this reporting is incredibly concerning. Relaying sensitive information to the #1 state sponsor of terrorism is just unfathomable."
Our security partnership in the region is based on the unshakable trust between the United States and Israel. We need to maintain that, and sharing sensitive information like this, if it happened, could really strike at the heart of the bilateral relationship.
State Department says this week the U.S. will begin a third round of negotiations to try to revive that 2015 nuclear agreement. A senior State Department official says there has been progress, though there needs to be much more to reach a deal.
If those allegations are true, what does that mean for our relationship with Israel?
Well, it will clearly strain the relationship. You have to have mutual trust amongst allies, that if I share with you my secrets, that you won't, tell those secrets to my enemy. And we have a very good relationship with Israel. And we need to have that relationship of sharing intelligence, one to the other. And when you have a senior official, such as somebody that would be in the position of the Secretary of State, that would go to an adversary such as Zarif, the foreign minister of Iran, and say, this is what your archenemy Israel is doing in Syria against your forces and your allied forces, that's incredibly problematic. Historically, we call that treason. Whether or not Mr. Kerry is going to be held accountable, I doubt it. Here recently, I wrote an article for American Thinker on the very topic of the nuances of a future Iran-Israel fight, primarily because Mr. Biden has relit the 2015 nuclear deal that Barack Obama put in place, and Mr. Biden wants to cause it to come to life again after Mr. Trump shut it down in 2018, and then in place put harsh sanctions that brought Iran to its knees. And we had it where we wanted it so that we could begin to negotiate and get some meaningful changes. But unfortunately, Mr. Biden threw that out and has now been meeting in Vienna, Austria, to negotiate a reopening of that 2015 JCPOA. And that particular plan would, at the same time, the Iranians would expect a relief on sanctions. And then meanwhile, of course, and this is a complexity, we have to recognize that Wang Yi, the foreign minister of China, was just in Tehran. They signed a new strategic 25-year agreement. And so with both Russia and China engaged with Tehran and the threats of perhaps throwing away the sanctions that we have on Iran, I see an empowered community with the Ayatollah at the lead that would once again restart and accelerate their nuclear program. And so if you were in Israel, you would say, look, our arch enemy, our existential enemy in Iran is now moving in a direction that's very dangerous to our own interest. And so the Israelis have already, according to the New York Times, have already acquired passage areas, air passage areas over Saudi Arabia and some of the Emirates in order to penetrate into Iranian airspace and could possibly take out some of their nuclear facilities. Is that going to happen? I don't know. But it's a real possibility given the instability that Mr. Biden, in part, has created with the state of Iran by opening negotiations and seriously considering removing sanctions.
Wow. What chance does the Biden administration have to convince those states to abandon their nuclear programs?
Well, I think Mr. Biden has, to a certain degree, already ruined it with regard to Iran by saying we want to negotiate, we want to revisit the 2015 nuclear program. We had the stranglehold, stiff sanctions in place that Mr. Trump put on that regime, and they were clearly under great pressure. But now that Mr. Biden is willing to compromise, I'm afraid, much like Barack Obama, they'll give the Iranians whatever they want in exchange for promises that are truly empty and void from the beginning. So I'm not sure Mr. Biden's going to do what's necessary.
Recently, President Biden called for America to end the war in Afghanistan. Is that the correct decision?
Now, the concern, of course, is that the Taliban, in a matter of months, if not years, will retake the government in Kabul, and the oppression that we helped overcome with regard to the oppression of women, the repression of the entire society will return under the likes of the Taliban that are really locked in the 14th century of human affairs. Now, are they going to host future Al-Qaeda? Are they going to host future other terrorist groups like ISIS that migrated from Syria to that battle space? Quite possibly. And that's the real concern there. And unless we have the capability of continuing to monitor and to stifle their growth, then we run into trouble. Now, I personally have welcomed the idea that we have spent 2,500 of our own lives over the last 20 years there. We've had 20,000 wounded in Afghanistan, and it makes sense for us to pull out the vast majority of our resources from Afghanistan and allow either the NATO forces that are there or the Afghan military, which we've spent nearly $1 trillion in trying to build up and prepare for this. I'm not sure that if we were to stay there another 100 years, it would change much. And that's the unfortunate reality that we're dealing with. It's the part of the world, it's the part of the culture. And so I tend to agree in this one area with Mr. Biden that, we do need to pull out, but at the same time, we need to have mechanisms to go back in either through airstrikes or through special operations forces. And I believe that we'll have that capability either from Bahrain or, certainly Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and other areas in either the stands or in the Western Persian Gulf to respond should things get out of hand once again.
Let's watch former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo explain how this administration is not prepared to confront the Chinese threat. Roll that, will you?
Based on what you've heard from President Biden, how weak are we in terms of facing the China threat?
Well, Dagan, if you listen to his rhetoric, would be fine, but you and I both know this is likely to be an empty promise. There's no evidence in the record that this administration is prepared to truly confront China. And when you hear language like competitor, we compete with the United Kingdom, we compete with Belgium, we compete with our friends and allies around the world. The Chinese Communist Party has declared war on the American worker. They did this years ago, and President Trump was the first leader to take this on, and our administration went full throttle to push back against this adversary. They want to steal our jobs. They've stolen our intellectual property. They're inside the gates conducting espionage here in the United States, even in our senior-most elements of our research institutes. This is a conflict that the Chinese Communist Party has brought on us, and we need to use the enormous American economic power to confront it on every front.
And one of the issues is that we're giving up that power by taking a axe to our energy sector. The climate promises out of this administration, the first day on the job, Joe Biden kills the Keystone XL pipeline, this climate promise on emissions reductions when we are already, as a nation, at the lowest emissions per capita since 1950.
Tegan, I described the United States decision to re-enter the Paris Climate Accords as the most enormous gift to General Secretary Xi Jinping, the head of the Chinese Communist Party, that you could possibly have given him. When I traveled the world, American energy independence, the capacity for us to deliver into Europe, into Asia, into even the Middle East, American energy was an important tool in our diplomatic kit. It gave America enormous capacity to influence how America was seen in the world. And so to hand that back, to give up this American energy independence when, in fact, China is dependent for importation for their petroleum projects in excess of 70% of their energy needs, this is an enormous mistake. This will undermine American security for people all across our nation.
What are your thoughts on this, Colonel?
Well, I certainly agree with Mike Pompeo that we are giving a lot away to the Chinese communists. They're building a larger nuclear arsenal. They are intimidating their entire region, whether it's the South China Sea, you talk about Vietnam, Cambodia, Thailand, certainly the Philippines and the Indonesians. Of course, that they've ratcheting up, activities against the Indians in Nepal and in their common border. The Chinese, without a doubt, and Mao Zedong back in 1950 when he was in Moscow made it very clear that they're at war with the West, and they have every intention of overcoming the West. And of course, thanks to Richard Nixon and when he went over with Henry Kissinger and started some sort of dialogue with the Chinese have been on the receiving end of a lot of technology, a lot of investment. We even agreed to help them financially in a number of ways, World Trade Organization and so forth. And today, of course, they don't abide by any of the rules for the most part. But what we need to understand, especially from a geopolitical perspective, is that they're expanding their military using the Road and Belt Initiative, which is a 2013 initiative by President Xi, to buy leverage in countries across the globe. And they're doing just that. And the other interesting aspect to what the Chinese do is they meld their military and their civil development programs into one whole entity. In other words, if your colleges and your civil sector and your military sector all combine their resources, you're going to be a fairly productive for their national strategic interest. And as a result, they're beginning to make strides that we are not making, in part because we've either been slow in development of these programs or we're refusing to invest, the nuclear program being one of those. Mike Pompeo is correct. We are in a very decisive time with regard to the Chinese. They are very, very serious. And if we don't stop, from kind of being in a stupor here and asleep, we're going to lose in a major way, not only our influence abroad, but perhaps our own country.
The communist China keeps sending warplanes into Taiwan's air defense zone. Sky News interviewed Taiwan's Foreign Minister Joseph Wu on April 28th of this year. Let's watch a clip from that interview.
It is perhaps the world's most dangerous flashpoint. An island already determined to defend itself that could bring the US and China to war. China says the island is part of its territory and has vowed to take it by force if necessary. An uneasy status quo that has lasted 70 years looks more difficult by the day. In an exclusive interview with Sky News, Taiwan's foreign minister said he feared the worst.
They have been conducting disinformation campaign, hybrid warfare, and recently they have increased their gray zone activities against Taiwan. And all these seem to be preparing for their final military assault against Taiwan.
Could Taiwan defend itself under those circumstances when China is such a big power?
This is our country, this is our people, and this is our way of life. And we will defend ourselves to the very end. And I should also point out that Taiwan happens to be on the front line in China's expansion of its authoritarian order. And if Taiwan is taken by China, I think the consequences will be global.
This is Taiwan's declared air defense identification zone. And this is where Chinese jets have been flying just in the month of April. Twice in the same month, China has also sent an aircraft carrier to the other side of Taiwan, surrounding the island, according to mainland state media. In response, the US Navy has been carrying out freedom of navigation exercises through the Taiwan Strait, water that the UK's own aircraft carrier will avoid on its maiden voyage this summer.
For the UK to think about sending military aircraft, military surface ships to this part of the world to show that the UK cares is also welcomed in this part of the world.
France, Germany, and Canada are also sending military ships to the region. These waters are becoming more congested. The possibility of miscalculation and its consequences more severe.
What message is China sending by these continued threats?
Well, it's making it clear that Beijing is not only serious about retaking Taiwan, either by diplomacy or, if that fails, by military force. And so the Taiwanese officials, as you had on the clip, understand the rising threat against them. And of course, the West is responding with NATO allies having ships in the area, with us, bolstering forces in Japan that are operating not that far from Taiwan, and of course by freedom of navigation through the South China Sea. You've got the Bashi Channel, which is between South China Sea and Taiwan, and it's through that corridor that you've seen incursions virtually every day for more than a year. Some of the most recent significant incursions by the Communist Chinese have been upward to a squadron of 25 aircraft at one time. And that would include not only J-16 jets, but also some of the heavy bombers that are nuclear capable. Now, are the Chinese going to take Taiwan by force? And if they tried, what would happen? I think inevitably, if you don't have some sort of resolution of the Taiwan issue for President Xi and his personnel in Beijing over the next 10 years, then President Xi's hold on power is really in disarray. He probably will fall to another. Therefore, I believe they're on a fast track, and that fast track could be anywhere from 3 to 5 years, that the Chinese, using aircraft, using amphibious operations, and of course they just launched their largest amphibious ship in history here a week or so ago. So the Chinese are indeed preparing for an invasion of Taiwan. They would prefer not to have to spend the blood and treasure to take Taiwan, but I do believe that the Communist Chinese in Beijing are deadly serious about it. We have forces, obviously, the U.S. Pacific Command, Indo-Pacific Command in Hawaii, but much closer, you have in Okinawa, you have forces in Japan, naval, air, ground forces, also in Korea, but they aren't nearly sufficient to overcome the anti-access capabilities that the Chinese communists have put opposite Taiwan on mainland China, which is only 100 miles away, and the very serious threat posed by surface and subsurface naval vessels that the Chinese have put in place. And you heard in the report about their aircraft carrier. They will soon have 3 aircraft carriers. They will soon have other capabilities that are nearly as good, if not better, than our own. So I would say, unless something diplomatically changes in the near term, and if the U.S. and its allies in the region don't bolster their forces, the Chinese are highly tempted to make a move on Taiwan.
Is the U.S. military prepared to confront the Chinese and the Russians, do you think, right at this moment?
Well, the Pentagon has to be prepared to do that under any circumstances on any battlefield. However, as I've indicated, on many fronts, we're being outdistanced in technology and in sheer manpower. Certainly the technology, whether it's in nuclear forces that are being improved by the likes of the Chinese and the Russians, which is undisputed, or it's the naval forces, which the Chinese, as I've indicated, have really exceeded what we have. And they have much of the technologies that we have as well, because they've been stolen over the years. The Russians' Navy is improved, but it's nothing like it was years ago. And so when you put all these factors together, if China and Russia act together, as I suspect they will, and that's sort of the premise of Alliance of Evil, it's mutually beneficial to act together, then I don't see that, in time, if we continue on the course that we currently are on, that we won't be outspent, out-resourced, and out-technologied, if that's a word, in the next decade. And so things could start to fall apart. This is a science, but it's also an art. And unfortunately, both the Chinese and the Russians have taken some of the best of our technologies and are beginning to use them effectively against us. And that's something that I know worries all of us in the Pentagon all the time.
Our former president was in the process of developing the largest armies in the history of America to make our army strong. Mm-hmm. And so it's sad to see us deteriorating when we need to be stronger than ever.
Absolutely.
If you want to read more about this, get both of the books at a beautiful price. Mm-hmm. Both of them for a $30 gift. That's $15 a piece.
Yes.
And these are great bestsellers. You want to get Robert Maginnis's great books. They're here for you to get today by just calling us.
Yes, and then also just a reminder, if you have not already ordered your Signal Relief patch, I want to say this is taking everyone by a storm because it's so exciting how people are ordering right now their Signal Relief patch. And I love what they're saying. They're saying we're taking it out, we're putting it on, and we're watching it work. And we hope that you will send us your testimonials as well. You can receive one of the Signal Relief patch for a donation of $155 to the ministry. But better yet, we have the double pack, which is 2 of the Signal Relief patches for a donation of $295 to the ministry. That does include shipping and handling. Remember, it's cost effective, fast acting, 100% drug free, and most importantly, which we love, it's a 120-day money back guarantee. So what do you have to lose? Right now, Dad, we want to listen to those of you who have sent in some testimonials. Let's listen to those testimonials on how Signal Relief is helping give people their life back. Let's watch this.
I couldn't even lift my arm sideways that much. Now I have this much range of motion. I can move it up like this. I have a 9-month-old grandson that I can hold again.
It does feel better. And actually my range of motion is better too.
My husband's always looking for other things that we can do. And he found out about the Signal patches. And he said, let's try this. I was to the point where I didn't care. It just felt like I had no life. And I started to think it would be better if I just killed myself. It was amazing. It helped to give me my life back.
So I put that thing on, and I sat there for a few minutes, and pretty soon I'm going, dang, that doesn't hurt anymore. I said, what is this?
That's pretty incredible. Could I have that back?
I don't know what's in that thing or what it does, but it works. It really, really works.
Yes, it
Wow.
does. And here it is.
And
the
everybody in
signal
our
relay.
family's using it.
Yes, amen.
I'm using it. I'm using it.
If you're having any discomfort, this will be relief for you. So call us at 1-888-988-1588 or write us at P.O. Box 7330, Branson, Missouri 65615. Or better yet, go to the website, jimbakkershow.com.
Well, you guys say put it on and try it, you know, but yesterday I used it all day on my back.
Yes, but that you're pointing out a great thing right there, because what we tell people and what we have learned ourselves from the experts is put it on even all day long. Take it off if you're going in a shower, if you're going to be in water. Remember, it's not waterproof, but put it on. Keep it on the area of discomfort to watch it work. And I promise you, that's the biggest thing I hear people saying, I do not want to take it off.
Right.
Because when I have it on, I can feel the difference and I feel that discomfort and you see the relief. And so remember to do that. Call us 1-888-988-1588 to order yours today.
Yes.
It was developed by military people. And they researched it and using the signal process of what they see like in radar or anything else. But this is a signal.
That's right. It's an antenna. The signal relief is a patch that intercepts the noise in your nervous system. It is called a signal filter. This allows for you to feel the discomfort wherever you may be feeling it. It helps bring relief to you.
Yes.
Well, our time's gone, and we hope you'll call right now. What's that number again, Lori?
It's 1-888-988-1588.
So call us and order your signal relief patch or your books from Robert Maginnis today.
Yes.
Our time is gone. We have to go. We want to thank Lieutenant Colonel Robert Maginnis for being with us.
Absolutely.
Remember that God loves you. He really does. Bye-bye for today.
Bye-bye. We love you. Call us.